In the early 2000s, Dr. Chap Clark, who is a researcher on adolescent issues, professor, he took a substitute job at Crescenta Valley High School in Los Angeles to research and study the behaviors and the beliefs and the practices of adolescents. Now, when he got there, he made it known to everyone why he was there. He didn't try to go in like a spy. He said, hey, I want to write a book, and I want to tell your story. And the students who were there talked, and they decided that they wanted him to do that. But they made him promise that he would actually tell their story and that he wouldn't spin it. And so he did. In his first work, which is called Hurt, and the follow-up, which is called Hurt 2.0, Chap wrote about the issues that adolescents are facing and the pressures that were placed on them, using that school he was at as a place to evaluate the data that the nationwide studies were putting out. In his time at the school and the subsequent writing that came after it, he found that as society in general has moved away from being a relatively stable and cohesive adult community intent on caring for the needs of the young to the free-for-all, independent and fragmented adults seeking their own survival. And this is key. He says, individual adolescents have found themselves in a deepening hole of what he calls systemic abandonment. You see, these kids who were supposed to be protected and they were supposed to be cared for, they have more or less been left to fend for themselves and to figure out their life on their own. This systemic abandonment that Chap writes about has been having dangerous and long-lasting effects in the personal and social development of adolescents for decades. And when you look at the timeline of when systemic abandonment really took hold, and when you compare it to the data that we looked at in the previous seminar, it becomes clear that this systemic abandonment has set the stage for the rapid growth that we have seen in diagnoses of anxiety and depression and suicide amongst adolescents. In her work, Dr. Madeline Levine, who is a well-respected researcher, has found that it's typically adolescents who experience the highest rates of depression, substance abuse, anxiety disorders, and unhappiness. And because of this, she speculates that the vast majority of adolescents are only one major event or catastrophe away from falling over the edge into dangerous and even deadly patterns of behavior and coping. Now, while there are a lot of unique influences that are shaping an adolescent's journey when it comes to this topic of mental health, I am convinced that the 5 factors we're going to talk about today in this seminar have been the main contributors to the systemic abandonment that we're seeing today. And as we've shown, that in turn has been the primary culprit, at least in the opinion of the guy giving this seminar, that has led to the growth of anxiety and depression and suicide amongst these students that we love. Now, the 5 factors that we're going to be exploring in this session are the disintegration or breakdown of the traditional family, the erosion of social capital, the rise of social media, busyness and stress, and then the decline of adolescent religiosity. When we can understand the magnitude and the impact of what this is actually doing to the mental health of adolescents, it's going to help us determine what our best response is moving forward. And so let's start off by looking at the first factor contributing to systemic abandonment. It's the breakdown of the traditional family. By this, I mean that the common understanding of what constitutes a family unit as being a mother and a father and a child in a home together is no longer the norm. Since the middle of the 20th century, there's been a big shift happening where this traditional understanding has become less and less common. In its place, culture has adopted a view that sees 2 individuals, regardless of gender or marital commitment, living together and raising a child together, right? In their mind, that is what a family is. Well, Dr. Daniel Siegel, who is an expert on brain development, specifically focusing on adolescence, he argues that this move away from the traditional norms has actually been detrimental to the healthy development of an adolescent's brain. He argues that healthy development, or what he might say is optimal development, it requires both a mother and a father who are actively involved with this kid's life in the family system. The collapse of the traditional family system has had consequences that nobody intended or anticipated. When there isn't a solid family system in place, there is a corresponding collapse in the structure and functioning of an adolescent's sense of self. Because it's the safety provided by the traditional family system that actually provides them with the content and valence of the self, which results in a balance of positive and negative self-evaluations. In essence, the family is a safety net. And when you remove the net before somebody is ready for you to, they get hurt. What the research indicates is that these changes to family systems have removed the stability that adolescents need in the most tumultuous time of their development, which is creating a climate that is more conducive to the development of depression and anxiety because they no longer have the needed support to navigate the complexities of growing up. You see, healthy development requires healthy families. And when the family breaks down, the kid breaks down. Well, that brings us up to the second factor contributing to systemic abandonment, and that is the loss of social capital. Another way of saying this is that adolescents no longer have the needed relationships with adults that contribute to their healthy development. In Bowling Alone, Dr. Robert Putnam, who is a world-renowned sociologist and researcher, makes the argument that social capital, which is a theory that argues that social networks have value beyond just meeting relational needs, he argues that social capital is a necessary element when seeking to create healthy change in both individuals and society as a whole. He argues that because of how rapidly American cultures and values have been shifting since the late 1990s, social capital across all of the generations was eroding. Now, there's a lot of reasons he speculates as to why this happened, but one of the most prominent that he points to was the advancements being made in technology. Because when these technological advances were combined with shifting cultural values, it resulted in social connectedness changing, causing the generations that used to be close together to drift apart. In 2015, Putnam wrote another book on social capital called Our Kids, and in this book, he found that the gap or the erosion between the generations had increased since he had last studied this. And because of this, it consisted of fewer, denser, more homogeneous, and more familiar and less non-kin ties. In essence, they drifted further apart. David Elkind argues that this erosion has actually happened for a reason. He believes it wasn't chance or fate. He says that it's happened because adults have abandoned their responsibility to care for the younger generations. And this has only served to fuel the destructive behaviors and practices that have contributed to the growing mental health crisis that we're seeing today. The erosion of social capital in society and in families has contributed to a climate that has further exacerbated the mental health crisis we're seeing here in the United States. Young people no longer have the necessary relationships with older adults who could help them navigate the hardships and complexities of growing up. See, the reality is adolescents actually are in need of adult supervision and relationship because too much freedom leaves them vulnerable to their own underdeveloped judgment. And this often has deadly consequences for those who are struggling with mental health disorders. And this brings us up to the third factor contributing to systemic abandonment. It's the rise of social media. And by that I mean we're not just living in a physical world anymore, we are also living in a digital world. The Pew Research Center recently conducted a study to assess social media usage trends amongst younger generations, and they found that 95% of teenagers between the ages of 13 to 17 have access to smartphones, and that 85% of them use those phones to access YouTube, 72% use them to access Instagram, 69% to access Snapchat, and 32% to access Twitter. When these teenagers were asked if they thought that using social media would affect their emotional state of mind, it was found that despite the ubiquitous, that's a weird word, despite the nearly ubiquitous presence of social media in their lives, there was no clear consensus among teens about these platforms' ultimate impact on them. You see, 45% of the adolescents surveyed believed that social media had no impact on their lives at all. 31% said it had a positive impact, and then you've got 24% who said that it was having a negative impact. In another study that was done of 500,000 adolescents who engaged in social media regularly, it was found that between the years of 2010 to 2015, the number of students participating in the study who experienced MDEs, which is a major depressive episode, we talked about that in the last session, it had increased by 33%, and the suicide rate in the females in this demographic increased by 65%. Researchers also discovered that between the years of 2007 to 2015, there was a rise in depressive symptoms that correlates with smartphone adoption during that same period. All right, let that sink in. The moment that smartphones were made available to the public, the moment social media gained widespread adoption, anxiety, depression, suicide, all of these rates began to spike. Now you got to stop and ask why. Is it possible that these two things are connected? Dr. Francis Jensen has argued that in addition to social media use, there's an increasing evidence of the effect of excessive internet use on the mood of adolescents. And several studies have shown a connection between depression, poor academic performance, and the inability to curb time spent online. See, there's a reason all of this is happening. It's because developing adolescents need to be with other people to develop mutuality and empathy. And interacting in digital mediums cannot teach these things to them. The rise of social media, when it's combined with the decline of social capital and the disintegration of the family, it has all together served to contribute to a climate that has led to the growth of the present mental health crisis. Well, let's look at the fourth factor contributing to systemic abandonment. It's the pressure, busyness, and stress that's placed on adolescents. When he was doing his research for the HURT project, Dr. Chap Clark found that the busyness, fragmentation, and stress levels adolescents experience is increasing due to the excessive demands that are made of them to succeed in the arenas of academics, sports, and extracurricular activities. He reached a conclusion that almost every student he interacted with at La Crescenta High School was experiencing the negative consequences of the busyness and stress that came from both internal and external demands to excel in every arena of their life. Dr. Madeline Levine argues that this pursuit of perfectionism and competition may actually be contributing to the psychological problems that many adolescents are currently dealing with. She discovered that the pressure for adolescents to succeed is contributing to the higher levels of emotional problems being seen in them, and this is leading them to internalize the message that tells them that anything less than perfection is failure. And this results in their self-worth and sense of self-being being tied to performance-driven agendas. The busyness and stress that adolescents are dealing with, whether it's from internal voices or external voices, has shown itself to be, based on the data, a contributing factor to the growing mental health crisis. And this brings us up to the final factor contributing to systemic abandonment, and that's the decline of religiosity. In other words, young people no longer seem to be interested in or care about religion. In 2017, the Pew Research Center's Religious Landscape Study was released. Right, this is a nationwide study of the beliefs and the practices of adolescents, and the results were shocking, but unfortunately not surprising, because it revealed that an adolescent's self-assessment of religion's importance in their life was on the decline. In the years that study was conducted, which were between 2007 to 2014, it was found that adolescents who self-identified as Christian had decreased by more than 8%, while those who consider themselves to be religiously unaffiliated, which is basically atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, that category jumped by 6%, from 16.1% up to 22.8%. Young people are moving away from religion. They're moving away from the church. During roughly this same time period, from 2002 to 2015, a team of researchers under the leadership of Dr. Christian Smith were completing the National Study of Youth and Religion, exploring how a changing cultural landscape was impacting the faith practices of teenagers. Well, the findings of Smith's team were released in 3 waves, which you can read about in the 3 books that they released, or you can go to the website listed at the bottom of your handbook. But the results revealed that across the United States, there had been a significant decline in adolescent religiosity as adolescents moved away from the religions of their upbringing and towards agnosticism and atheism. Right? For young people who are searching for hope, for young people who are searching for truth or for meaning, this is really problematic, because they are now growing up with a secular or humanistic worldview that can't give them any of those things. You see this move away from religiosity, and as a result, away from an objective moral standard for what is good and true and beauty. It has only served to fuel the hopelessness that many adolescents are feeling right now, which further exasperates their experiences with anxiety and depression. You see, each of these 5 factors is significant in and of itself and presents significant problems for the healthy development of an adolescent. But when they're combined, the results, they're disastrous. Right? No wonder adolescents feel hurt. No wonder there's even a thing called systemic abandonment. When you look at what's actually happened in our culture, could it really have turned out any other way for the students that we're caring for? I mean, these kids, they don't have stable homes. They don't have trusted adults that they could go to when they're hurting. They're not allowed to be kids anymore. Instead, they have to live up to the expectations that other people place on them. They don't get the opportunity to rest. They're always having to keep up this facade of who they are, all the while denying the things that they really feel, and they do all of this without knowing the hope that the gospel offers them. Our system is broken. But luckily, there are some things that we can do to start to change it. And we're going to get to that in session 5. We're going to spend some time before we do that, though, looking at some themes and mandates that we can find in Scripture that are going to guide our response and even tell us why we need to be people who respond. But as you close out this session, I'd love to invite you to take a few minutes to reflect on the stuff that you find at the bottom of your handbook for this session. We've got some questions there that I hope you're thinking about how you've seen these 5 factors in your own ministry and the students that you know. And as you go through this, I encourage you, pray for these kids. Pray for God to give you wisdom to figure out how to respond in a way that is helpful and hopeful. And when you're ready, join us in session 4.